Welcome to the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. Today, we're going to be looking at the fictional country of Carana, specifically their Criminal Investigation Services, or CIS, in the Galasi province. And, when we talk about capacity building, we're talking about systematically looking at what an organization does well, where it might be struggling, and then figuring out the best ways to help it improve and reach its goals. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today with the Galasi CIS. To do that, we are joined by an expert in capacity building and development.
Thank you.
Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
So first, can you give us a little background on Carana and the Galasi CIS?
Certainly. Carana is a fictional country with a national police force of about 7,200 officers. The Galasi province is one area within Carana and has a population of 3 million people. That includes internally displaced persons, or IDPs, who may face specific challenges and vulnerabilities when it comes to security. Within Galasi, the police department itself has 2,500 officers, with only 150 of them being women. The Criminal Investigation Services, or CIS, is the specific branch of the police force that handles investigations. They are currently understaffed with only 250 officers, and of those, only 12 are women.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant gender imbalance. Does that raise any red flags for you right away from a capacity building perspective?
It certainly does. It suggests potential challenges in recruitment and retention of female officers and raises questions about how effectively the CIS can address the needs of a diverse population, especially when it comes to crimes like gender-based violence.
That's an important point. So we have this context of a relatively small investigative unit within a larger police force operating in a province with a significant population, including some particularly vulnerable groups. Where do we even begin to assess their capacity and identify areas for improvement?
Well, there are a number of tools and analytical frameworks we can use. One common approach is the fictitious analysis. This stands for political, economic, social, technological, environmental, legal, and security. It allows us to systematically examine the broader context in which the CIS operates and how these various factors might be influencing its strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so let's unpack this Pestel-S framework, starting with the political dimension. What are some of the key observations about the Galasi CIS?
One striking observation is the lack of a policy within the CIS that prohibits officers from affiliating with political parties. This raises concerns about potential bias and undue influence, especially given the fact that the CIS leadership has close ties to the dominant political party in Carana.
So without that separation, there's a risk that investigations could be compromised or influenced by political agendas.
Exactly. And we also see that political changes at the national level often lead to reorganizations within the CIS. These frequent shifts in leadership and structure can be disruptive and make it difficult for the CIS to develop and implement long-term strategies.
It sounds like those constant reorganizations would really undermine any progress they're trying to make. What about the economic dimension? What stands out to you there?
One of the most pressing issues is the lack of a defined budget for the Galasi CIS. They share operational costs with the Public Security Department, which means resources are often stretched thin.
So they're essentially competing with other departments for funding, instead of having a dedicated budget for their investigative work.
That's right. This lack of financial autonomy makes it difficult for them to invest in essential equipment, training, and personnel, all of which are critical for effective investigations.
Moving on to the social dimension, what are some of the key social factors influencing the CIS's work?
The fact that all CIS officers belong to the Falan ethnicity, which is the majority group in Carana, while the province itself is much more diverse, is a big one. This raises questions about their ability to understand and engage with the diverse communities they serve. It can also lead to perceptions of bias, particularly if certain ethnic groups feel they are not being treated fairly by the police.
That makes sense. And we also talked about the lack of female officers, which is another social factor with potentially significant implications for the CIS's effectiveness, right?
Absolutely. It's not just about numbers either. Women are largely absent from leadership positions within the CIS, despite having a strong position in the local culture. This lack of representation at all levels can discourage women from joining the CIS and perpetuates a culture that may not be as sensitive or responsive to the needs of female victims of crime.
So from a capacity building perspective, these social factors highlight the need for the CIS to focus on diversity, both in terms of recruitment and in fostering a more inclusive organizational culture.
Precisely. Now, it's important to note that while there are these areas of concern, the Galasi CIS also has some strengths within the social dimension. For example, they have a strong connection with community leaders and elders, which can be a valuable asset for building trust and gathering information.
That's a good point. It's about recognizing that even within areas where improvement is needed, there may be existing strengths to build upon. What about the environmental dimension? Is that even relevant in this context?
It might not seem immediately relevant to policing, but environmental factors can actually play a significant role. In the case of the Galasi CIS, there's a lack of awareness and action. Regarding environmental sustainability, their practices and policies don't seem to consider the environmental impact of their operations.
So you're saying that even something like how they manage crime scenes or dispose of evidence could have environmental consequences.
Exactly. And this lack of environmental awareness may also reflect a broader lack of forward thinking and responsible resource management, which can have implications for their overall effectiveness.
It sounds like this pestle-S analysis is really helping us to unpack some of the broader challenges and opportunities facing the Galasi CIS.
It absolutely is. By understanding the political, economic, social, and environmental context in which they operate, we can start to identify the root causes of some of their challenges and develop more targeted and effective capacity-building strategies.
So we've covered 4 of the 7 dimensions of the pestle-S framework. Let's dive into the remaining 3: technological, legal, and security.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to unpacking its aspects further. Welcome back to the International Policing Podcast on Capacity Building and Development.
We're continuing our analysis of the Galasi CIS, looking at how various factors might be impacting their ability to effectively conduct investigations and serve their community. Before the break, we were using the pestle-S framework, which helped us break down the political,
economic,
social, and environmental influences on the Galasi CIS.
That's right. We saw how things like political interference, lack of funding, and limited diversity within the CIS can create significant obstacles.
So let's tackle the remaining 3 dimensions of pestle-S. Starting with technology, what observations did you make about the Galasi CIS?
One glaring issue that jumps out is their limited forensic capabilities. They lack a certified laboratory, which means they have to rely on external facilities for even basic forensic analysis. This can lead to significant delays in investigations and compromise the quality of evidence.
So if they're collecting evidence at a crime scene, they're not able to analyze it in-house, they have to send it off somewhere else, which takes time and might not even yield reliable results.
Exactly. And this lack of forensic capacity also extends to their personnel. They don't have enough officers with specialized training in areas like fingerprint analysis, ballistics, or DNA testing. This further limits their ability to process and interpret evidence effectively.
It sounds like a real bottleneck in their investigations. What about the use of technology for things like surveillance or communication? Is that factored into the technological dimension as well?
Absolutely. And in the case of the Galasi CIS, we see some concerning practices. While electronic monitoring is being used, it's often done irregularly by other government entities without any standardized procedures. This raises concerns about accountability and the potential for misuse of surveillance technology.
So it's not just a lack of technology, but also a lack of clear guidelines and oversight in how that technology is being used.
That's right. And this can further erode public trust, especially if people feel they're being monitored without justification or recourse.
Moving on to the legal dimension. What stands out to you about the legal framework within which the Galasi CIS operates?
One significant issue is that their policy for arrest and detention is outdated. It's based on colonial-era laws that may not align with international human rights standards. This raises concerns about potential abuses of power and violations of due process.
So even if they're conducting an investigation properly, the actual procedures for arrests and detentions might be problematic from a legal and ethical standpoint.
Precisely. And this can lead to challenges down the line, especially if cases are thrown out because evidence was obtained improperly, or if there are allegations of mistreatment of suspects.
Are there any other legal gaps that you observed?
There's a notable absence of policies regarding asset seizure, confiscation, and recovery. This means they're limited in their ability to effectively disrupt criminal networks by seizing proceeds of crime. It also creates a situation where criminals may be able to continue to benefit financially from their illegal activities, even after being apprehended.
It seems like a missed opportunity to not only hinder criminal enterprises, but also to potentially use those seized assets to further bolster their own resources.
Exactly. It's a gap that definitely needs to be addressed.
Okay, so we've looked at the technological and legal dimensions. Let's wrap up our pestle-S analysis by delving into the security dimension.
When we talk about security in this context, we're not just talking about the overall safety and security of the Galasi province. We're also looking at how those broader security challenges impact the CIS's ability to do its job.
So things like widespread crime or political instability would obviously affect their operating environment.
Absolutely. And in the case of the Galasi CIS, one major security challenge they face is the occurrence of crime-induced riots, which often escalate into ethnic conflicts. These riots pose a significant threat to public order and safety, and they often overwhelm the CIS's capacity to respond effectively.
And we know from our earlier analysis that the CIS is already struggling with things like understaffing and limited resources. So these riots are basically exacerbating those existing vulnerabilities.
That's right. And what's even more concerning is that the CIS often doesn't investigate these riots as criminal matters. They view them primarily as public order issues, which means the underlying causes and potential criminal elements driving the violence are not being adequately addressed.
So it becomes a cycle where the lack of thorough investigations allows those responsible to potentially incite further violence with impunity.
Exactly. It's a dangerous cycle that highlights the need for the CIS to adopt a more proactive and comprehensive approach to addressing these security challenges. They need to view these riots not just as events to be contained, but as potential crime scenes that require thorough investigation.
So we've now gone through all 7 dimensions of the pestilence analysis.
Yeah.
Political, economic, social, technological, environmental, legal, and security. What's fascinating is how this framework reveals these interconnected layers of challenges facing the Galasi CIS. It's not just about them not having enough officers or resources. It's about the political climate they operate in, the legal constraints they face, and the broader security context that shapes their priorities and actions.
I agree. The pestilence analysis has provided us with a comprehensive understanding of the external environment of the Galasi CIS. Now, to dive deeper into the internal workings and capabilities of the CIS, we can use another analytical tool, the 5 areas of capacity building and development analysis.
Okay, so we're going from this big picture view of the CIS's operating context to a more granular assessment of their internal functions and structures. Let's jump right in and take a look.
Let's do it.
Welcome back to the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. We've been using a couple of different frameworks to really get a good understanding of the criminal investigation services in the fictional Galasi province of Carana. Before the break, we walked through the pestilence analysis, which helped us understand the broader context in which the CIS operates. It highlighted some serious external challenges, like political interference, limited resources, and a volatile security environment. Now we're going to shift gears a bit and look internally at the CIS itself. Can you tell us about the framework you mentioned, the 5 areas of capacity building and development analysis?
Certainly, this framework allows us to zoom in on the CIS's internal functions, almost like taking a close-up X-ray. The 5 areas we look at are policing services, enabling services, police policy formulation, accountability mechanisms, and stakeholder engagement.
All right, so we're getting into the nuts and bolts of how the CIS actually operates. Let's start with policing services. What does that encompass, and what are some of the key observations about the Galasi CIS in this area?
Policing services cover the core functions of any police force, particularly the knowledge and skills of its officers, and how those officers are organized and directed, which we refer to as command and control.
So essentially, how well equipped are the CIS officers to do their jobs, and how effectively is their work managed?
Exactly, and what we see in the Galasi CIS is that there are some significant gaps. They lack a clear understanding of intelligence-led policing, meaning they're often reacting to crime rather than proactively using intelligence to prevent it.
So they're always a step behind, playing catch-up instead of being able to anticipate and disrupt criminal activity.
That's right, and this is compounded by a lack of training in crucial areas. Their officers haven't received adequate training on human rights, sexual and gender-based violence, SGBV, proper use of force, or even basic awareness of issues like child protection and HIV/AIDS.
Those are pretty fundamental areas of knowledge for any police officer, especially those involved in investigations. It seems like these training gaps could be a major contributing factor to some of the issues we've already discussed, like the mistreatment of suspects or the failure to adequately address violence against women.
Absolutely. These gaps have very real consequences. Now, on a more positive note, the European Union has been offering sophisticated training programs for the Carana police, with a focus on organized crime and violent extremism.
So there are at least some opportunities for professional development within the CIS.
Yes, and that's something to build upon. However, even with these specialized trainings, the frequent reorganizations within the CIS, often tied to political changes, create a real problem.
Right. We talked about that in our pestilence analysis. How does that instability impact their command and control?
It creates constant disruption. Leaders and priorities are constantly changing, which makes it almost impossible to develop and stick to long-term strategies. It's like trying to build a house on shifting sand.
Okay, so we've got some serious challenges in the area of policing services. Let's move on to the next area. Enabling services. What falls under this category?
Enabling services are the essential behind-the-scenes functions that allow the CIS to operate effectively. Think of it as the backbone of the organization. This includes things like human resources, budgeting, and logistics.
So it's about having the right people, the necessary funding, and the proper equipment and infrastructure to support their work.
Precisely. And in the Galasi CIS, all three of these areas are riddled with problems. Their human resources practices are opaque. There's a lack of transparency in recruitment, transfers, promotions, which can lead to cronyism and favoritism.
So there's no guarantee that the most qualified people are getting hired or promoted, which could be contributing to some of the skill gaps we discussed earlier.
Exactly. And on top of that, there's a significant pay disparity between officers, with women being paid considerably less than men for the same work.
Wow, that's a glaring example of inequality. It's no wonder they're struggling to recruit and retain female officers.
It's a major obstacle, and this pay gap isn't the only thing holding women back. There's no clear policy for career progression or retention specifically for women. They lack mentors, role models, and a clear path to advancement.
It's like they're facing a brick wall every step of the way.
Yeah. What about the budgeting aspect of enabling services? We touched on that a bit in our pestilence analysis.
Yes, and it's just as problematic as the human resources situation. The CIS doesn't have its own budget for operational costs. It shares resources with the Public Security Department, which puts them at a constant disadvantage.
They're always having to justify their spending and fight for scraps, rather than having the financial stability to plan and invest strategically.
Exactly. It's a hand-to-mouth existence. And then there's the issue of logistics. The Galasi CIS lacks systems for maintaining their infrastructure and equipment.
So they might have vehicles that are constantly breaking down, outdated technology.
Yeah.
And facilities that are falling apart. That's the reality. And this lack of maintenance not only hinders their effectiveness, but it's also incredibly wasteful. They're constantly having to replace things that could have been kept in good working order with proper upkeep.
Okay, so we've covered policing services and enabling services. And it's clear that the Galasi CIS has some serious work to do in both of these areas. We still have 3 more areas to explore within this framework: police policy formulation, accountability mechanisms, and stakeholder engagement. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. It's been a fascinating discussion.
It really has, and I think it highlights just how complex and challenging capacity building can be, especially in a context like the Galasi CIS, where you have these interconnected layers of internal weaknesses and external pressures.
I agree. It's clear that there's no quick fix, and that any successful capacity building effort would require a comprehensive and sustained approach. Addressing those root causes that we've been talking about, we'll have to leave it there for today. But thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. We hope you found this discussion informative.